Okay. And then you guys are also encouraged to ask each other things.
Yeah. Yeah, the
I
idea.
want to know about George's leg muscles.
Stop it. We're going live now, so be careful, Mickey.
Patricia, remember my hearing. So I don't have my hearing things. So loud and clear, please.
Can you hear everybody okay right now, like this?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, we're now streaming on Facebook. So I'm going to wait for a couple of welcome attendees. I see the numbers are starting to enter. And we had a lot of responses to this talk. So I'm going to wait a few minutes to let a couple more people come in before we start.
Shoot, I don't even know how to decline.
This is a warning to everybody that this might be a surprise event. Anything goes. So Ricky, should we start and then what do you think?
Give us a minute or two while people still stream in. I saw the numbers go up a little bit. So
Yeah.
thanks everyone for joining us.
Okay. Hi, Leanne Perez and Jorge Perez. Nice to see you all. We're starting momentarily. We're just going to give Ricky a few more minutes too.
All right. Yeah, you come through.
Let's get going now, actually.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and start knowing that people will be joining us, but I'll start off with a little introduction. And I thought that because this falls, though the occasion for this is to be a joyous occasion, sadly, a very dear friend of both the Wolfsonian and the Perez Art Museum passed away yesterday, Terry Riley, and I didn't want to go on without acknowledging his passing and the friendship that he offered and the legacy that he leaves, not only in Miami, but globally. I mean, Terry was an amazing scholar, curator, architect, museum director, a close personal friend, a mentor and a teacher, and he so generously shared with everybody who knew him. And I mean, in the early days of the Wolfsonian, he was one of the first advocates and consumers of the Journal of Decorative and Propaganda Arts, and really understood what Micky was trying to do and really promoted us through MoMA. And of course, George, I know you're so proud of the building that he helped build for the Perez Art Museum, which is the most outstanding and beautiful building, among the most outstanding and beautiful buildings in our city. So I think we all want to celebrate the life that Terry lived, though too short, and the legacy he leaves, not only here, but in all the places he touched through his curatorial work, his intellectual work, and his architectural work, and the friendships that he shared. So now we're on to perspectives on collecting, and I'm so happy and thrilled. We've tried to do this before, but getting Micky and George, you'd think it'd be easy to get Micky and George on the same Zoom at one time and one place, and I'm so excited to do this now. I mean, I was just thinking today that, George, I met you and Micky probably the same year, the mid-70s. So while I've worked with Micky very closely for 40 years. I've known George on and off since the mid-70s and when we both started our work at the city. I want to thank you both for your willingness to share your thoughts on collecting. And before I do so, I want to first just thank the supporters of Bakehouse that make our programs possible. The Miami-Dade County Department of Cultural Affairs and Cultural Affairs Council, the Miami-Dade County Mayor and Board of County Commissioners, the State of Florida Department of State, Division of Cultural Affairs, and the Florida Council on Arts and Culture, the Florida Humanities Council, the Wiley Family Foundation, the Knight Foundation, the Perez Family Foundation, Crearte at the Miami Foundation, the Lynn and Lewis Wolfson II Family Foundation, and Arison Arts Foundation. Their ongoing critical support makes everything that we do at Bakehouse possible. I also want to thank the team at Espacio 23 and the Wolfsonian for the assistance with all the IT and PR for this event. I want to introduce Ricardo Moore, who is with the Bakehouse team, and he will be fielding the questions that you can post, either if you're attending via Zoom, post your questions in the Q&A box, and if you're attending via Facebook, post your questions there, and a little later in the program, Ricky will come on and field those questions. And I want to introduce and thank Patty Hanna, who is co-partnering with me as moderating this event. Patricia Hanna is the art director of Related Group and Espacio 23. And Patty, I'm going to let you go ahead and throw out the first question.
Okay, I'll start off soft. So how about that? Thank you all for participating. Micky, George, looking forward to speaking with you all and Cathy as well. So I just, I guess we'll get into the specifics of collecting and your specific collections, but I guess maybe we can start on a more broader term and address your perspectives on collecting as individuals, perhaps knowing that your works will end up in public institutions. So can you give us an idea? I guess both of you can address the issue on what your process is for collecting, so to speak.
Micky, do you want me to start or you want to go ahead?
George, please start.
Okay. Patty, to me, I think collectors are all like drug addicts, you know. Art is one way, or if a stamps is something else. We just need to have, I think, this deep desire to own things, you know, that are beautiful or meaningful. And with me, thank goodness, it happened to be art, you know, at different points of my life. It was coins and stamps and so forth. But for the last 40 years, it's been art. And I've been passionate about this. This is something that is very personal. But I don't collect anymore because I want to see a picture that I collect in my house, you know, 4,000 artworks, you know. I don't get to see them at all. But just the fact that it's, you know, coming to my possession, that there's an ownership of that beautiful thing becomes very important. The other thing that was very important for me in collecting is that I felt that Miami, and Miami's always been, since my college days, the city that I wanted to live in, needed to be more than just a tourist location. And all great cities to me had great culture, great museums, great opera houses, and so forth. So it was very, very important to me that all this gathering of art pieces with, you know, with some logic to it became part of the public realm, and everybody got to enjoy it at the end. So that's what collecting has meant for me.
How wonderful. It's the opposite with me. I must address the fact that Miami is a city that's been colonized. This is not a great imperial city like Detroit or Cleveland or Paris or one of the great imperial cities that had colonies. We are the colony. We've been colonized. And thus, that's created an atmosphere and a feeling which always made me feel as a colonized person in the second tier. And since I was going to live here, would have to live here because of family considerations and our family business here, I thought that the best thing would be to create an atmosphere or an institution in which I could remind myself of the references that Miami didn't have, but would have one day. I'm not a collector at all. I only wanted three things in life, and that was a railroad train, because I came from Miami, and the railroad was freedom. Like many people, it was coming up from the South to find the urban imperial cities like New York. And once I discovered that, I thought of the famous old song, "How are you going to keep them down in the swamp after they've seen New York or Paris?" But I knew that my destiny was here, and I tried to make it a place that had reminders of what was in the past and what could be in the future. So I've always had a sense of loss, and I was born in 39, and my father went to war soon after, and the whole world changed for me in the Second World War and after. And I think this sense of loss and things being forgotten gave me this missionary zeal to save what I could of the past. So I am definitely a preservationist and not a collector. The other two things I wanted was I wanted to travel and learn and go to the great academies of the world. Those are those cities I referred to in the past. And the third thing I want, like a lot of children, I wanted a castle. So I did get all three. I got a train car and then finally a train, and I got a castle. It was the last castle ever built because it was built between 1897 and 1913. And the men and women went off to war in 1914 and never came back. And I also have still the occasion to travel. But I didn't want anything that I, in quotes, collected. I preserved them because I wanted to associate with them and to understand where I came from and where the city came from and what we could become. So that was really my motivation. It was enlightened self-interest, really.
I mean, George, just following up to that question to Micky. I mean, I understand Micky always talks about, his collection, being somewhat autobiographical. I mean, it tells the story of his life and his travels and many things, the things that he tried to preserve. And your own collection. I mean, obviously you have a really interesting background, George, where your family history and where you came from and how you arrived in Miami. I mean, your collecting interest, would you say that any of your personal history and your personal story or the politics of the countries from which you came influenced your collecting interest?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes and no. I think the yes is very much so in that when I started collecting, I didn't want to lose my roots. And that's why I collecting Latin American art. To me, that was a way of staying in touch with my culture. I remember that as a young man, when I just finished university, twice a year, I would go to Sotheby's and Christie's, so, 1 week. And it wasn't just collecting the art, and that's what I started collecting the art in these auction houses, but it was, those are the Latin American art auctions, and we would all get together, all these people that collected art, and we talked about what was happening in Latin America. And I didn't want to lose touch with Latin America, so that gave me the access, to all those minds discussing, current affairs. Art was an expression of what was going on in those countries. So, for example, I started collecting Mexican muralism that was talking about the exploitation of the natives in Latin America. I've always liked Mexican art because they didn't look towards Europe and towards the United States, but it looked internally as a source. But as I started getting more and more into art for art's sake, as I call it, I left some of those reasons for collecting, and I started looking at different areas, and they had different motivations. Some of them were still social, so I collect a lot of contemporary African art, for example, that has the same experience as Latin America in countries that have been colonized and have had very similar experiences of a different culture and a different race coming and enslaving you. It happened worse in Africa, but it also happened in Latin America with the church and the native populations. But as I grew, I started getting into these art movements that I liked just for the sense of the beauty of the art, the color, the form, the expression. So I started getting into, for example, American abstract expressionism, nothing to do with my background. German, German expressionism, nothing to do with my background. They were art movements that I really admired. There were many artists that their use of color and form and substance was to my liking. So the collection started taking, it's like started from a big river like the Amazon, and then it has all its tributaries, right? And I think I drive Patricia and everybody nuts because I come with a different tributary, like seems like every week, right? So I try to make sense out of it, right? I don't know sometimes if I do it in a sensible way, or do I fit the round peg into the square because I wanted to sort of fit in the collection. So yes, it's very personal in many ways, and it has to do with my background, but I have learned to try to disassociate myself and clean my mind of that background and find and be open to new ways of thinking and new ways of seeing.
That's a fascinating, because there are many similarities and much diversity. My collection is really not art for art's sake. It's art in function of ideas. And we don't collect anymore nationally. I don't collect German or Italian or Japanese art. I collect linguistically, because I believe that the language you speak determines the form you make. So I'm very interested in 7 languages, in particular, Italian, German, Dutch, English, Japanese, Slavic, mostly Russian, and Celtic. And those are my 7 languages, but of course, we have a little number of works in Spanish and Romanian, other, but those are my 7 major areas of collecting. And really, I didn't trust history because it was always written from a point of view. And I wasn't an artist of any sort. I tried, but it was to no avail. And I'm cautious of the spoken word because you can say many things convincingly for a long time, but if they're not truthful or if they're distorted, you'll be found out sooner or later. So you have to be very careful what people say to you. You must have the process to determine your own destiny, if you will. So I found that in art and in there was more truth because it was closer to the true expression of the human condition by the individual. So I'm very interested in biography and autobiography because I feel that the truth is expressed through the ideas that are transformed into artworks. So it's art in function of ideas, and it's determined by the language you speak. And that I've stuck with. I didn't. George has done the correct thing, and he's been open to new strains and new thoughts and new processes and new styles. And I stayed mostly in the period 1880 to 1950. And it's mostly, there's very little abstraction or expressionism. It's mostly realism or precisionist art.
I guess maybe following on this point, although your collections are very different, there's something that does unite you both where you feel, and you can see it in the exhibitions we've done at El Espacio 23. The first one was called Time for Change. This second one is called Witness. Micky also talking about, your own personal history and the objects and you collect. And so there is an interest in art or artists acting as agents for social change, right? So you are giving, a voice to these artists and what they're trying to say. And so I guess for Micky, when was that point for you where you realized the power of, social justice in art, or the power of an artist to create change or to be a voice for others that may not have a voice?
Yeah, it came mostly from my educational, the education I had at high school and at college, and then in graduate school. I had very good history teachers, art history teachers, and a man who was one of the founders of the United Nations and was very good about the study and use of propaganda. And those educational resources influenced me enormously. And then my travels also taught me a certain missionary. I had a missionary zeal to look for tolerance and justice for people, having seen so much intolerance and injustice.
And although, Georgia, you say you have many tributaries, right? And you say you collect maybe for the beauty of an object or a painting.
No, the beauty doesn't interest me.
No, for George.
It interests me. It does for George.
Yeah.
But for me, it's what the object represents, symbolizes, and spiritually means about the maker.
Well, so let me, Patricia, before you get to that, the answer, but that goes to everything that I say. So, for example, if I look at some contemporary African art and you look at the concepts that they express, and those concepts tend to be, anti-feminism, capitalism, exploitation, slavery, migration, and so forth. There's different ways of saying this. What I as a collector do is I study deeply, okay, the forms of expression that are going to portray that idea in a very powerful way. Because just saying, it's like, making it in simple terms, anybody can cook a steak, but some of them are great steaks and some of them are bad steaks, right? So the idea of, the expression of all those isms, can either be done well or it can be done poorly. As the collector, to me, the spoken word is extremely important. I am probably the most avid reader in the world. So I spend 6 hours a day just on art reading, right? But just because the person says, this is the way that our people were displaced and they had to leave a country and they suffered, it can be said in a way that becomes so powerful that it will really influence lots of people. Or it could just be a statement like I just made that is a passing statement that doesn't influence anybody. I think art, without the use of words, has the capacity to portray that, and that's where I think the difference between great art and just mediocre art comes. And by the way, and it's a very elitist concept because I am making the judgment of what is the good way of expressing that, as opposed to others, right?
Well, I don't know if I'd call it elitist, other than I think what you share in common is you both have points of view and you have very personal approaches to collecting. And in many ways, I see a lot of the overlaps. I think the language that you use to talk about your own respective collections might be slightly different, but in looking at George, I was just over there looking at Witness, and I mean, had those paintings been done in the last century, they would be in the Wolfsonian. So I think, the themes that interest you, in terms of identity, migration, slavery, exploitation. I mean, are the same things that.
That's exactly
But it's
why
funny how you two describe it so differently when it's so
That's right.
funny that you,
But
you know,
just
maybe because you're of different centuries, because maybe Mickey's reference is a language from a different time. I mean, languages evolve, but you know, maybe.
I think in what I hear, I mean, Mickey, and I don't want to put any words in. I think from what I hear, Mickey's is much more intellectual than mine. Mine combines the intelligence with that gut feel and the sensational, the emotional that comes into just purely a picture just entering me, you know, as opposed to reading and analyzing, right? I look at art sometimes and it's just powerful. I mean, I started getting goosebumps. I have no idea what the art is about or what it tries to say. Okay, so I think that's a big difference.
is emotional, the emotional effect of the art. That's well said. Mine is perhaps more intellectual, and George is more emotional, and that's a very interesting point, which I would like to further, because um, George's has to do with feeling, because there's a lot of abstraction, and the color and a lot would appeal to the emotions in contemporary art, while in my period, it's more literal, if you want. It's more storytelling through pictures, but it's more literal. And in George's, it's more emotional, because his inner feelings are affected by the color, the schematics, the formation of it. It's an interesting diversity, but the effect is the same, and that's educational.
Well, I guess maybe that it makes me curious, Mickey, as to your process. Perhaps knowing more about contemporary art, we know we see works in art fairs and in artist studios and in museums, as do you. But how do you go about researching? Your collection is so unique. How do you find these objects? How do you go about, you know, I'm just curious as to your process and getting that. Obviously, it's a lot of research, but how do you find objects, or where do you go?
Um, I go everywhere, and this is art which lay dormant for many years. It went out of fashion, as after the Second World War, with the great immigration of the European avant-gardists. This literal interpretation of the figure and of the scene went out. So it's a lot of it's underground, and that's the fun of it, because I'm really the hunter gatherer, and that's given me enormous pleasure to ferret it out. It's not today so obvious as it was once upon a time, when this was a style which was much more popular and also considered accessible. But abstract art and the new modern art is more evolutionary than, or I would say even revolutionary than what I am interested in. So that's, and they're dealers, few everywhere, and collectors often in wherever one is. I find WPA objects and artworks everywhere, but not so obvious. And I'm very interested in the New Deal and the Roosevelt period and the progressive period before that, and then all the colonial period of the Victorian age, because I'm 1885 and you know the country, as I said, until 45, which I thought was the dawn of a new day, but it wasn't the dawn of a new day. The dawn of a new day was 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. So I miscalculated somewhat, but that's neither here nor there. So it's a style which I prefer and I've stuck with, while George is more flexible and more actually evolutionary than I am, because I stuck with 2 precise dates and 7 precise languages and the period in those languages.
So I guess, sorry, Cathy, did you want to say
Oh,
something?
no, I was just going to say, just in asking Micky to maybe share, and maybe George too can share, one of the, Micky, I could probably name a zillion really unbelievable ways in which you've acquired things. The Dutch room, the head of whatever the Brazilian, what's his name, Vargas, the Japanese magazine collection. Could you share a couple? It's easier today because of technology to know where things are. But when Micky started, he literally had a manual Rolodex, which he still maintains. So, and that's how you would find things or keep up with people. So maybe if you could just share a couple of, and then maybe George, you could share just a couple.
I think George should go first because
Okay.
I'm sure George is more scrupulous than I was. And I'm sure.
Oh, the pianos. George, is there anything that you've bought in something that you've acquired in sort of a non-traditional way that contemporary collectors collect? Outside the gallery, the auction, I guess you've commissioned.
Look, ours is such a holistic approach. Patricia and I spent our lives, looking at magazines, at publications, at museum editions, going to every city and visiting every art fair, visiting all the galleries, visiting the artist studios when we go to every city. And in addition to that, now the internet has made it even worse. I guess it's better, but makes it even more difficult because they bombard you with all this new information. So I just try to, there's not one way, we just, for example, we just finished buying a major piece of art, major, gorgeous piece that has been in storage, all belonging to a European collection that we had a friend saying, I think there's an incredible opportunity for you to come over to this warehouse, and look, and we looked at it and go, oh my God, we knowing the artist becomes very important as you follow them, they become friends. Knowing the galleries become very important, the auction houses become very important. And now there's this whole internet of Artsy and ArtNet and all these new phenomena that are just bombarding you. So it's difficult, the decision-making process when I started was so much easier, right? Now the art is different. It's I think Micky was right. We're changing by the second. I'm looking at so many new things. That I don't know what I'm looking at. So I'm consulting all the time, and I'll get something new, and I'll send 10 emails out to Franklin from the museum and Patricia and Renee and the guys from Europe and saying, look at this artist. Does anybody know? It seems like really important. So, and then I read all their responses, and then we might fly over to wherever the artist is. So it's a very participatory process until you get to know the artist. And then you would say, wow, now I got this artist, and we rest. We don't, you know, once we get the artist, we want to build on that collection of that artist, because if you like him, you should just continue to build on it. And at the same time, opening yourselves for new ones. So we end up buying a lot of art. Fortunately, I'm able to, and I love it, right? I mean, it's something that really inspires me, and it makes me happy. And I think we've become very good at it, you know, very good at mixing the personal with an educated eye.
You're lucky, and I'm lucky too. You're lucky because you follow the living, and I'm lucky because I follow the dead. None of my artists are alive, so they can't argue with me. And that's been one of the great adventures, is bringing back to life people who, for whatever reason, have passed out of the picture frame, that were valid artists at the time, but somehow went out of fashion.
So Micky brought something which is important. He says they can't argue with you. And when I started collecting art, and it was first Latin American art, I was collecting my parents' art. You know, they took me to museums, and I saw Diego Rivera, and I saw, you know, all the dead artists, you know, typically people that were born before the World War II, that were producing art probably from the 20s to the 60s, okay? And then they all died in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and so forth, right? Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, Torres Garcia, all these great Latin American, Mata, Lam, all these great Latin American artists that were the first ones that I did. When I first gave my collection, that first collection entirely to the museum, I sort of liberated myself from my parents' influence. So I said, I want to meet the artist. I want to ask him, why did they paint that red? Why is that monkey in that picture? Why did you use the color this way? Why are you dripping the paint in here so it looks that way? I can't do that with dead people, you know? And I can read about it, but it's not the same. When you go to a studio and you're really participating with them in that creative process and asking them why, and understanding much more, then I think you learn more on a very personal basis, and B, at least to me, the art becomes much more important and much more personal.
Well, that participation is true. When you participate with the individual, there's more that comes together. In my case, it's reading and rereading the message and trying to fit the message into the vision of the human condition and how we became what we became, and what these artists were trying to express, whether it was danger or whether it was celebration or commemoration. I wanted to know the reason why, and I wanted to know what was behind the image. And it was stimulating and exciting. And it still is, but it's what is so interesting is I am haunted by what George said about the intellectual and the emotional. I think my collection is not as filled with emotion, but it's filled with a message. The messaging is louder and clearer, but not as emotional. It's a moral tale, really, while the art that George is interested in is more complete and more thorough. And the fact of the participation is absolutely what everybody looks for in art. The Renaissance asked you to participate in the painting. And that's why you can't export from Italy paintings, furniture and the like you can, but paintings are too intimate. You were asked to participate. You're in the paintings, actually. And that's very important. Participation is thrilling for a collector, I would say. And I participate in an abstract way, and George participates in an intimate, immediate way. And also, people today want experiences. They want to participate in experiences. And I think contemporary art, to have it as an experience is very very thorough. Not everybody shares that view, but I can understand while one is contemplative and the other one is participatory. It's an interesting diversity.
So here we have Ricky. Ricky, do we have a lot of questions, or do we want to start taking some questions from the panel that have been submitted? It looks like there's been quite a few.
Yeah, so I would like to actually start with a comment that Beth Dunlop left. She said that this is a fascinating program, that she thinks that George approaches collecting as an anthropologist and Micky as an archaeologist. Would you agree with this assessment?
George as a
anthropologist and you as an archaeologist.
I like the thought.
George, what do you think?
I don't see the connection through anthropology or archaeology. I mean, yes, in archaeology, Micky is digging the facts and bringing them out to life, so they don't get lost, and is discovering things that perhaps would have been lost. I think that is more clear. I don't see myself as any one of those things. I think myself as much more of, look, we have lots of art that have words and express, opinions. I think of the Peruvian, writer that takes newspapers, and paints and writes the copy of the newspapers that had with the bombing of different towns during the World War. You couldn't be any more verbal and intellectual and cold than him in the narration of history. But I think mine is just a lot more varied, and I think I'm trying to express thoughts, ideas in just a more in many different ways, whether it's sculpture or paintings that have the word as the message, or paintings that have color as a message, or painting that have form as a message. I think I come through that in many different ways.
Okay, and for the next question, do both of you consider your collections as works of art in and of themselves?
I mean, there's no question about that. Yes, for my side, yes.
Micky, do you see your collection as a work of art?
No, I see it as a collection of ideas.
That's an interesting perspective. So the next question. So for both of you, what advice do you have for collectors who hope to inspire their interest in their collection with their children, or those who will become stewards of the objects?
My advice, I guess, is have an open mind study, 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 study. And you're going to find, like everything in life, that your tastes and everything will change the more knowledgeable you become of the subject matter. And I think of my younger, now he's a teenager, but a few years ago, anything that wasn't hamburger or spaghetti and meatballs, he wouldn't eat, right? But as your tastes are refined, doesn't mean that you don't like spaghetti and meatballs anymore, but you learn how to appreciate more things, which could be bigger and better things.
I would only add, I agree, I would only add to the coming collector, trust your instincts.
Okay, and so we had a few questions for both of you about sort of the public-facing aspect of your collection. Why did both of you decide to make a museum, and why did you decide to make these collections public?
I don't have a museum. The Wolfsonian, it's a given. We never, ever use the word museum. It's neither on the stationery nor on the building. It is not a museum. Great cities, imperial cities, have museums. Startups, the muses haven't settled here yet. It's coming, and it's coming fast. It's here, but when I started, it wasn't. So we call it an educational resource or a cultural center, but it is not a museum. And that's a given with the collection. It's called the Wolfsonian because we thought it was fun to name it after the Smithsonian. And Mr. Smithson died in Genoa, and I've lived in Genoa for 40 years. So it was just a curious coincidence, but it sounded good. But we're not a museum.
And George, what about El Espacio?
Well, El Espacio is the Perez is much more of a museum than El Espacio is. And the reason that the Perez Art Museum is important is, as I said before, I don't think there's any great city, as Micky will call them, imperial cities, without great museums. It's just not. Las Vegas is not going to be a great city. It's a gambling city. I mean, until it becomes a totality where culture thrives. I think Miami is on its way of becoming that. The growth of Miami intellectually over the last 20 years has been immense, probably larger than any city in the world. I always envisioned that I was going to participate in making Miami, which I consider my hometown, into one of those imperial cities. So maybe 100 years from now, we will be an imperial city with great museums, and we will be part of that culture. I always wanted to have particularly people that could not fly to New York and to Paris and London to see great art, to see it here. One of my greatest joys is when I see the children coming from public schools and they're 4 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old, and they sit with their teachers in the museum and they start going over these great artworks and their imagination just thrives and they start asking questions, That's why you have museums. You educate people, you make them better, you make their lives fuller, and they can understand the world better. That's why it's important for me to have public art places.
I share that totally.
And then in addition to that question, how do you think the legacy of the collections that you've established will grow and be preserved in the future?
Doesn't depend on me. It depends upon the participation and the acceptance by the public. If the public feels it's a learning force, it'll survive. If the public engages with it, it'll survive. If the public feels that it's important for their lives, of the city, of the community, and their identity, it'll survive.
George, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
I think we're probably in the period of history. There's been more participation in art. Before it was, the lords and maybe the people that went to church got to see some murals in the churches and so forth. Today, art is much more universal. I think it's much more democratic. The internet has helped tremendously. I mean, like the Saatchi collection, for example, you'll see that they'll come over to you and you can buy things from $500 to $5,000 as opposed to the multi-million-dollar pieces. I think art has become something that people like to collect and like to deal with. We have seen an incredible increase in the purchase of all types of art, whether it's old masters or Renaissance art or church art or contemporary, it has been the highest growth. So yes, I think as this world becomes more interconnected, art will play a bigger and bigger role, and people will be much more participant in the whole cultural events. And
both of you have collected such vast troves of in the various fields that you collect in. For both of you, do you have one work in particular that holds special meaning to you, or that that you would consider above everything else?
In my case, it's all a mosaic that if you put all the pieces together, it describes the human condition. And I don't have a favorite piece, because each piece, like a mosaic in a puzzle, contributes to the whole picture.
To me, that's when they ask me, what's your favorite building that you built? And I always answer the same way, the next one. The joy is in the collecting, the joy is in exploring, the joy is in finding new things and new ways. So right now, I'm searching, I hope I never stop searching.
Have you ever considered, George, an NFT?
Have you considered what?
One of those non-fungible, those NFTs. Have you bought it? Have you ever considered any of that?
I don't understand the question. Have I considered?
The NFTs, the digital art now, NFT?
I don't even know what it is, Kathy, so I definitely have not considered.
Okay, you're not collecting it. Well,
I want to know about I read about it in the paper today, the Create grants program.
There you go.
Well, I can tell you that Bakehouse has been one of the lucky beneficiaries of the generosity of the Perez family and the Create Foundation. And George, obviously, this is, you could tell people about it. They're accepting applications now, but it's an incredible, generous gift from the family to our community to really support art making, artist residencies, and educational access to arts in Miami. So as not only one of the beneficiaries, but I think representing the entire cultural community that either benefits directly or indirectly, I really want to thank you and your family for this very generous program.
You're welcome. And then it's a joy. It's really a joy to do it. I mean, I do it for very selfish reasons. It makes me feel very good.
Yeah. All right. Before we end, because the time's coming up, I thought we would just maybe end in asking you each, is there something special you'd like to ask of each other that you might not have known or you're curious about?
How did it feel? How did it feel leaving in a castle? I passed by your castle when I was in Genoa, which is one of these cities like Naples to me, that is sort of like gorgeous, but it's like an old lady that's still beautiful, but you really need to look at, you need to look hard to see the gorgeous.
Brilliant and dazzling, but alas, no heat.
And Micky, you have something special you'd like to ask of George that maybe you don't know or are curious about?
Good heavens. Finding George one of the charismatic personalities of the city, it's awfully hard to ask him a single question. And I was very much impressed by his family, and I like that he works in the old-fashioned way with his family involvement and on all fronts. And I thought that was really a good lesson and a good reflection of the individual. And he builds his buildings, I know, actually for people. So I appreciated that too. There are lots of questions I would ask him, since he's just coming in from jogging and exercises. I wonder how his leg muscles were, but I'm not going to ask him now.
But it's funny what you say about the family, because I think that's fundamentally two things that you both, strongly share is, the generational participation and engagement of your families in this community. And I think it's great that there are a number of families now that are starting to emerge. Micky, your family's been here 5 generations, still active, involved in Miami, and it's mostly education. So it's really great to have two really great contributors to our city and sharing some of your thoughts with us tonight. I mean, Patty, do you have anything else you'd like to ask or say before we close and thank everybody for being here?
No, I just have one final question that as it came up when George was talking about how his collection changed after the initial donation to Pam, where a collector finds him or herself starting from scratch, from the beginning, anew, right? And that was a major rupture, in George's collecting process. So just to close, Micky, if you had a chance to start over or, start anew, would you go in a different direction? Would you continue, on your same mission?
No, I go on, and it starts over every day for me, as it does for George. It's never static. It goes from morning to night, and it's always a renewal. And let me tell you something interesting, and I've thought about a long time. Collecting and gathering and participating, it is how should I put it? It's a challenge to death. It's a curious thought, but people that collect and do things with a collecting mentality, they are in a way challenging death, because they are participating in what men and women make. And we too become makers in that process. And as a maker, we are alive and doing things, making things. And that is really an alternative to death. So it's a strange thought, but there is some sort of relationship there.
Well, this could probably go on, and I think on behalf of Patty and myself and Bakehouse, El Espacio and Wolfsonian, we want to thank you all on behalf of the community. I think we want to thank both of you for all that you've contributed and what you will continue to contribute, and for the incredible assets that you've placed in the public patrimony and the role models that you've played for so many others and will continue to play for others as the city moves forward into its next chapter. So thank you, Patty. It's been a
Thank
pleasure
you.
doing this with you, and Micky and George.
Thank
for
you.
being
Always a
here.
pleasure being with you guys, especially with you, Micky. I've admired you for a long time, and keep on collecting, my friend.
You too.
And maybe, Micky, think about a jog tonight. Good night, everybody, and thank you so much for
Night.
being with us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.